Hi, good afternoon. I'm Michael Coppage, and Professor Andrew Gould and I, as the organizers of the Perspectives on World Politics series, would like to welcome Professor Steve Levitsky back to the Kellogg Institute about 20 years after you were a visiting fellow here. I hadn't realized it had been that long. Just for your information, other recent or upcoming speakers in this speaking series on the theme of parties and populism include Alan Hicken, Anna Jamal-Abusa, and Susan Stokes. Steve Levitsky is the David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies in the Department of Government at Harvard University. He has written uncountable, I think literally, I tried to count them and I could not find all of them. But uncountable articles and chapters on Argentina, Latin American politics, regimes, institutions, populism, the left, labor unions, political economy, and I'm certain a lot of other topics as well. And many of these articles are very familiar to our students. He's also the author or co-author or co-editor of 5 books. And each of the first 4 made a mark, Transforming Labor-Based Parties in Latin America, Argentine Democracy, Informal Institutions in Democracy, and Competitive Authoritarianism. The last one written with Luke and Wei, and the others, two of the others had co-authors as well. But of course, the motive for this visit is his most recent book with Daniel Ziblatt, How Democracies Die. And this book has received just praise all over the place, like from Nicholas Kristof, David Leonhardt, Paul Krugman, Ezra Klein, Jonathan Chait, E.J. Dion, Darren Ajimoglu, Francis Fukuyama, Larry Diamond, and others in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Sunday Times, Financial Times, Foreign Affairs, and The Guardian. And they use words like lucid, essential, sober, dispassionate, nonpartisan, smart, deeply informed, persuasive, alarming, powerful, brilliant, extraordinary, urgent, magisterial, compelling, terrifyingly timely, and scholarly yet readable. And my favorite is Entertainment Weekly, which in a weird way is the highest honor an academic book can receive. They don't pay attention to most of them. But by the way, Entertainment Weekly said, maybe have a drink before digging into this one. So let's all give Steve a well-lubricated welcome to the Kellogg Institute.
Thank you, Michael and Andy and the Kellogg Institute. As Michael pointed out, I was here 20 years ago, and it doesn't seem like it's been that long. But I was here just out of graduate school as a postdoc, and had a wonderful time here. The weather was great, and it was fall, and really the weather was great. I'm heading to the downside, but it was a great intellectual community. People were very friendly. The only problem was that the football team sucked. It was really bad. I mean, God gave me 1 semester here at Notre Dame, and it was a sub 500 season. And people were frantic. There were literally letters. What's the name of the campus undergraduate newspaper? There were letters to the editor imploring God to fire the coach. And there was one point, touchdown, Jesus put down his hands. It was not a good semester for football. I'll get back to that later in the talk. But times have changed. 20 years ago, South Bend was known as the home of Notre Dame football, and now it's known as the home of Mayor Pete. My friends were jealous that I was coming to South Bend. So anyway, so I'm here to talk today about some of the dangers facing American democracy, and really from virtually any social science perspective, I should not be giving this talk. Social scientists haven't learned much, but we've uncovered 2 pretty rock solid facts about democracies. One, rich democracies never die. And secondly, old democracies never die. In fact, no democracy even remotely as old or as rich as that of the United States has ever broken down. Political scientist Daniel Treisman from UCLA calculated the odds of a democratic breakdown in the United States relative to those of other historical cases, he found that based on its age and its wealth, the US is 35 times less likely to suffer a democratic breakdown than Germany in the early 1930s, and 134 times less likely to suffer a democratic breakdown than Chile in the early 1970s. So statistically speaking, US democracy should be pretty safe. But there are reasons to think that we are in uncharted terrain. First of all, levels of income inequality in the United States are higher than at any time since before the Great Depression. That is enough to keep Adam Jaworski, the guy who showed us that rich democracies never die, awake at night. Those are his words, not mine. Secondly, the United States has begun a transition that, to my knowledge, no democracy has ever successfully undergone, one in which a previously dominant ethnic group loses its majority status. I will return to that point. And third, for the first time, arguably, in nearly 2 centuries, Americans have elected a president with visibly authoritarian instincts. So I think there's at least some reason for concern. So I'll go on in the talk. I should point out that democracies don't die the way they used to die. Democracies used to die at the hands of men with guns. So during most of the 20th century, certainly during the Cold War, 3 out of every 4 democratic breakdowns took the form of a military coup. Generals seized power and formed a junta. Today, democracies die in a much more subtle way. Most democracies today, since the end of the Cold War, died not at the hands of generals, but at the hands of elected leaders themselves. Elected presidents and prime ministers who use the very institutions of democracy to subvert it. They use elections, they use referenda, they use acts of Congress, they use Supreme Court or Constitutional Court rulings. This is Hugo Chavez, it's Putin, it's Orban in Hungary, it's Erdogan in Turkey. What's so dangerous about this electoral road to autocracy is that it happens behind sometimes a pretty credible facade of democracy. There are no tanks in the streets, the Constitution remains intact, there are elections, Congress continues to function. In fact, many of the steps that are taken to subvert democracy on their own look pretty benign. The government may sell them as measures to enhance public security, to combat corruption, to clean up the electoral system. And as a result, many citizens are not aware, or at least not fully aware, of what's happening until it's too late. In 2011, 12 years into the presidency of Hugo Chavez, a survey showed that a solid majority of Venezuelans still believed they were living under a democracy. So if democratic breakdown begins today at the ballot box rather than in the barracks, one of the keys to protecting democracy lies in keeping authoritarians from getting elected in the first place. Americans arguably failed at that task in 2016. And that's pretty surprising. There are many reasons why Donald Trump got elected in 2016, but in our book, we focus on one reason that we think doesn't get enough attention, and that is the candidate selection system. Historically, the United States has had no shortage of extremist demagogues, from Father Coughlin to Henry Ford to Huey Long to Joe McCarthy to George Wallace. Each one of those folks at some point had public support in the 30 to 35% range, not that far from Donald Trump when he got elected. But none of these figures even got close to the center of power. No, none of them got close to the presidency. They were kept out in part, in good part, by the party's candidate selection system. As all of you know, prior to 1972, US presidential candidates were selected by party leaders in and around conventions, in what we often think of now as smoke-filled back rooms. That system, the old convention system of selecting candidates, was not very open, it was not very inclusive, it wasn't very transparent, and it sure as hell wasn't very democratic. But it was a pretty effective gatekeeping mechanism. Party leaders, party bosses, knew all of the potential candidates because they had worked with them. In many cases, they'd worked with them for years. So they knew their strengths, they knew their weaknesses, they knew which of them were fit for office, they knew which of them, crucially, were demagogues. In fact, for all of its shortcomings, and there were many shortcomings, the old convention system had a perfect record in terms of keeping demagogues out. Now, the primary system that we adopted in 1972 is much more open, much more inclusive, much more democratic. But it weakened dramatically party leaders' role as gatekeepers. And we saw this very clearly in 2016. Republican leaders, almost to an individual, despised Donald Trump. They knew damn well he was unfit for office, but they had no means in the primary process to stop him. So primaries, we argue in the book, and this is the least popular argument we make in the book, are double-edged. They're more democratic, but they leave us more vulnerable to demagogues. Had the old convention system been in place in 2016, Donald Trump wouldn't have gotten anywhere near the White House. Now, electing an extremist demagogue is never good for democracy, but it does not condemn us even remotely to democratic breakdown. This is where our institutions come into play. Americans have a lot of faith in our Constitution for good reason. We have the oldest, arguably the most successful Constitution on earth. Our Constitution has checked effectively numerous powerful and ambitious presidents in the past. Jackson, Teddy Roosevelt, FDR, obviously Nixon. But constitutions by themselves are never enough to protect a democracy. Even the best designed constitution on earth does not just function automatically. Constitutions have to be reinforced by strong, unwritten rules, what we call democratic norms. And the book focuses on two democratic norms in particular. One of them is what we call mutual toleration, which is simply accepting the legitimacy of our partisan opponents. That means that no matter how much we disagree with our political rivals, no matter how much we dislike our partisan rivals, we recognize both privately and publicly that they are loyal citizens who love the country just as much as we do and who have an equal and legitimate right to exist, to do politics, to compete against us, and if they beat us, to govern. In other words, we do not treat our rivals as enemies. The second norm, a little bit more complicated, is what we call institutional forbearance. Forbearance means refraining from exercising one's legal right. It is an act of deliberate self-restraint. It is an underutilization of one's power. We don't often think about forbearance in politics, but it is absolutely vital. Think about what the US president is constitutionally, legally able to do. We're getting reminded of a bunch of these things these days. Presidents can pardon whomever they want, whenever they want. Any president with a congressional majority can pack the Supreme Court. Don't like the ideological composition of the Supreme Court. If you have a majority in Congress, you can expand it to 11, to a 13, pack it with allies. Perfectly legal. The president can circumvent Congress and make policy through executive orders, or as we now know, by declaring a national emergency. The Constitution does not prohibit such action. Or think about what Congress has the constitutional ability to do. Congress can refuse to fund the government. The Senate can use its constitutional right to advise and consent to prevent the president from filling cabinet seats and from filling Supreme Court vacancies. And the House can impeach the president on, in effect, any grounds it chooses. My point here is that politicians can exploit the letter of the Constitution in ways that eviscerate its spirit. Court packing, partisan impeachments, government shutdowns, national emergencies. Legal scholar Mark Tushnet calls this sort of behavior, using the letter of the law to subvert the spirit of the law, he calls it constitutional hardball. Let me give you one example of constitutional hardball from my part of the world, Argentina. Argentina's 1853 constitution was modeled explicitly on the United States. One study found that 2/3 of the Argentine constitution were basically plagiarized from the US Constitution. They were translated into Castellano, but modeled very, very heavily on the United States. But Juan Perón used that very constitution to undermine Argentine democracy. One of the first moves that Perón made after getting elected in 1946 was to have Congress impeach 3 out of 5 Supreme Court justices on grounds of malfeasance. Perfectly constitutional. Congress then passed a law making it a crime to disrespect the president. This is a law. When opposition leader Ricardo Balbín was arrested under this law, he challenged its constitutionality in the courts, but the packed Supreme Court upheld it, so technically legal. Look at any failing or failed democracy anywhere, and you will find an abundance of exactly this, of constitutional hardball, whether it's Spain and Germany in the 1930s or contemporary Hungary, Poland, Venezuela, Turkey. What prevents a democracy from descending into this sort of destructive spiral of constitutional hardball is forbearance. It's a shared commitment among politicians to institutional restraint. Think about presidential term limits in the United States. Prior to 1951, for 150 years, the United States Constitution placed no limit on presidential re-election. Legally, American leaders could be president for life, just like Hugo Chavez. But for nearly 150 years, following a precedent set by George Washington, no president sought a third term. It was not the Constitution that prevented ambitious presidents like Jefferson, Jackson, Grant from seeking a third term. It was a norm of forbearance. Or take the Senate filibuster. The filibuster is a very powerful tool. It can grind Congress to a halt. But for most of the 20th century, for a good chunk of the 20th century, the filibuster was almost never used. The Senate recorded an average of fewer than one filibuster a year between 1917 and 1960. Senators exercised forbearance. These two norms, norms of mutual toleration and forbearance, are what Daniel and I call the soft guardrails of democracy. They are what help to prevent normal, healthy political competition from spiraling into the kind of partisan fight to the death that wrecked democracies in Europe in the 1920s and 30s and in South America in the 1960s and 70s. Now, the US has not always had these soft guardrails. Didn't have them in the 1790s when institutional warfare between the Federalists and the Republicans nearly destroyed the Republic before it took root. The guardrails obviously collapsed in the run-up to the Civil War, and they remained weak all the way through the end of Reconstruction. The 1860s, the 1870s were replete with constitutional hardball. Changes to the size of the Supreme Court in 1866 and 1869, a presidential impeachment in 1868, a fraudulent election in 1876. Norms of mutual toleration and forbearance really only took hold in this country in the late 19th century. And they did so only after the Republicans basically abandoned Reconstruction and allowed the Democrats to establish and consolidate Jim Crow in the South. It was only after the Republicans gave up on the pursuit of racial equality in the South that Southern Democrats ceased to view the Republicans as an existential threat. And only then did the two parties begin to peacefully coexist. This is an important point. The norms of mutual toleration and forbearance that undergirded our 20th century democracy, the democracy that most of us grew up under, emerged out of a profoundly undemocratic arrangement, the political exclusion of African Americans. This is a point to which I will return. With that caveat in mind, norms of mutual toleration and forbearance were in fact quite strong in the United States during the long 20th century. Democrats and Republicans, beginning in the late 19th century, accepted one another as legitimate, and they avoided pretty systematically destabilizing acts of constitutional hardball. There were no impeachments, there were no successful court packings. Senators exercised their right to advice and consent with restraint. Presidents had their Supreme Court nominees approved even when the other party controlled the Senate. And outside of wartime, and there were a lot of wars, but outside of wartime, presidents refrained from circumventing Congress. They did not declare national emergencies when Congress didn't pass their bills. So for more than a century, for 120-ish years, our system of checks and balances worked pretty well. But again, it worked not only because we have a pretty well-designed Constitution, but because that Constitution was reinforced by strong norms of mutual toleration and forbearance. We argue in the book that America's democratic norms have been unraveling over the last quarter century. There were signs of this in the 1990s. Newt Gingrich, who became House Speaker in 1995, instructed his Republican allies beginning in the late 1980s to use terms like betray, anti-flag, and traitor to describe Democrats. In other words, he encouraged his fellow Republicans to use a discourse that abandoned mutual toleration. Gingrich was also a master of constitutional hardball. He engineered the first major modern era Democratic shutdown in 1995, and 3 years later, the Republican House impeached Bill Clinton essentially on a technicality. That was the first impeachment in 130 years. The erosion of mutual toleration in particular accelerated during the Obama presidency. Republican leaders in the beginning in the 2008 campaign, Republican leaders like Gingrich, Palin, Giuliani, Huckabee began to tell their followers, both privately and publicly, that President Obama did not love America, that Obama and the Democrats were not real Americans. The birther movement obviously took that a step further, questioning whether President Obama was an American at all. I'll give you one quote that I think that calls my attention. Colorado Congressman Mike Kaufman declared at one point, "I do not know if Barack Obama was born in the United States of America, but I do know this, that in his heart, he's not an American. He's just not an American." Now, the US has always had an extremist fringe, but this was no longer fringe politics. These were national Republican leaders. This was the party's 2016 presidential candidate. This was the National Republican Convention live on primetime television chanting "lock her up" about Hillary Clinton. So leading Republicans were now beginning to deny the legitimacy, or at least question the legitimacy of their Democratic rivals. That worries us, because when mutual toleration evaporates, when we lose mutual toleration, politicians start to abandon forbearance. Because when we view our rivals as enemies, when we view our rivals as an existential threat, we grow tempted to use any means necessary to stop them. And that is basically what's beginning to happen. So when Republicans took over Congress in 2010, they adopted a strategy of outright obstructionism. There were more filibusters during President Obama's second term than in all the years between World War I and 1986 combined. And it was not just trivial stuff. Congress shut down the government twice and at one point pushed the country to the brink of default. President Obama responded with constitutional hardball of his own. When Congress refused to pass immigration reform, refused to pass climate change legislation, he circumvented Congress via executive orders. That was technically legal, but clearly violated the spirit of the Constitution. But the most stunning act of constitutional hardball of all, at least during the Obama years, was the Senate's decision in 2016 not to allow President Obama to fill the Supreme Court vacancy created by the death of Justice Antonin Scalia. That move was unprecedented since 1866. All that stuff happened before Donald Trump was elected president. So the problem is not just that Americans elected a demagogue in 2016. It's that we elected a demagogue at a time when the soft guardrails protecting our democracy were coming unmoored. So why is this happening? We argue that what's driving the erosion of our democratic norms is polarization. Over the last 25 years or so, Republicans and Democrats have come literally to fear and loathe one another. In 1960, I'm sure many of you have heard of this, there was a famous survey that asked both Democrats and Republicans how they would feel if their kid married someone from the other party. 5% of Republicans and 4% of Democrats said they would be upset if their kid married somebody from the other party. Today, that number is close to 50%. A recent study by Liliana Mason found that about 60% of both Democrats and Republicans believe that the other party is a danger to the United States. And more than 40% of each party agree with the statement in surveys that the other party is not just bad for the country, but downright evil. That's a quote. We have not seen that level of partisan hatred since the era of Reconstruction. Now, this is not just liberal conservative polarization. People do not fear and loathe one another over taxes or health care. Today's partisan differences run much deeper. They're about race, religion, and way of life. American parties have changed dramatically over the last 50 years. Their names haven't changed. In some respects, their platforms haven't changed. But they've changed fundamentally in terms of the coalitions they represent. Back in the 1960s and 70s, Republican and Democratic parties were culturally and demographically very similar. Both parties were overwhelmingly white and Christian. Three changes have happened over the last 50 years. First of all, the civil rights movement led to a massive migration of Southern whites from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party at the same time that African Americans, at least particularly in the South, newly enfranchised, become overwhelmingly Democrats. Secondly, over the last 50 years, the United States has experienced a massive wave of immigration, primarily from Latin America, also from Asia. Most of those immigrants and their kids ended up in the Democratic Party. And third, since Reagan, since the early 1980s, evangelical Christians, which used to be split evenly, in fact, slightly more Democratic than Republican back in the 1970s, have now overwhelmingly settled in the Republican Party. So today, Democrats and Republicans are racially and culturally very distinct. The Democrats are a sort of crazy rainbow coalition of urban educated whites and ethnic minorities. Nearly half the Democratic Party vote today is non-white. And the Republicans, by contrast, remain overwhelmingly white and Christian. So what? Why does that matter? It matters because white Christians are not just any group. Not only were they once a solid majority, but they once occupied the top rungs of all of this country's social, economic, and cultural hierarchies. They filled the presidency, they filled Congress, they filled the Supreme Court, they filled all the governor's mansions. They were the CEOs, they were the newscasters, they were the movie stars, they were the college professors, they were the pillars of local communities, they were the faces of both the Democratic and Republican parties. Those days are long over. But losing a majority, more importantly, losing one's dominant social status can be deeply threatening. Many Republican voters, not all, but many Republican voters, feel like the country that they grew up in is being taken away from them. And for many, that feels like an existential threat. This, we argue, is what fuels the Republican Party's radicalization and what ultimately drives polarization of our politics. The problem is that polarization, when extreme enough, can kill a democracy. Research by Milan Svolek at Yale shows that the more polarized a society becomes, the more willing we become to tolerate undemocratic or abusive behavior by our own side. When politics is so polarized that we come to view a victory by the other side, by our partisan rivals, as something that's catastrophic, as something that's intolerable, we start to justify using extraordinary means to prevent them from winning. Things like violence, election fraud, coups. That is what wrecked democracy in Spain in the 1930s, Brazil in the 1960s, Chile in the 1970s. Now, Americans have not reached that point, but we have reached a point where, according to exit polls in 2016, 1 out of 4 Trump voters, 1 out of 4 people who pulled a lever for Donald Trump, said, according to surveys, that they did not think Donald Trump was fit for the office of the presidency. They voted for Donald Trump, but they said they did not see him as fit for the office of the presidency, and yet they still preferred him to Hillary Clinton. We've reached a point where, according to polls over the last 2 years, Republicans have a much more favorable view of Vladimir Putin than they do of Hillary Clinton. Those are dangerous levels of polarization. Donald Trump is a symptom of that polarization. He didn't cause it, and his departure from the presidency will not end it. So what's happened in the 18 months since we wrote this book? I think we've had both good news and some not so good news. The good news is that America's democratic antibodies are pretty strong. The Trump administration has faced pushback on multiple fronts, from the media, from the courts, from law enforcement agencies, from civil society, and from the opposition. Last year's midterm elections, the 2018 elections, made it very clear that we are not like Hungary or Russia or Turkey or Venezuela, where authoritarian governments steamrolled weak oppositions. The United States has a strong opposition. That opposition now controls the House, which makes it much harder for the current administration to concentrate or abuse power. So that's good news. The not so good news is that the underlying problems of polarization and norm erosion have not gone away. Our system of checks and balances, our Madisonian system of checks and balances, only works well with a minimum level of mutual toleration and forbearance. Without forbearance, without a minimum of restraint, divided government can very quickly descend into a state of permanent institutional warfare, in which constitutional checks and balances are turned into partisan weapons. That's a world of stolen Supreme Court seats, of partisan impeachments, of government shutdowns, of declarations of national emergency. That's the danger we face today. A few months ago, Daniel and I had we're fortunate enough to have a meeting with a group of US senators, and one of them told us that he's convinced that never again, the way politics are constituted in the United States, will we see a successful Supreme Court nomination when the president's party doesn't control the Senate. In other words, Merrick Garland is about to become the rule rather than the exception. So America may not be descending into autocracy, but it is clearly sliding into dysfunction. In 2019, divided government did not bring negotiation and compromise like the founders envisioned. It brought the longest government shutdown in US history, followed by a fabricated national emergency aimed at openly defying the will of Congress. That is serious dysfunction. At minimum, this is very likely to prevent us from addressing some major problems facing this country in the years to come. And worse than that, if deadlock and dysfunction persists over time, citizens may well lose confidence in the democratic process, may lose confidence in our system, which would leave them even more vulnerable to the appeals of demagogues. So what can be done? I have no idea. Couple of things. For one, it is clear that the Republican Party has to change. It has to become a more diverse political party. As long as the Republicans remain an overwhelmingly white Christian party in a society as diverse as ours, it will be prone to extremism and to constitutional hardball. I want to develop this point for a minute because I think it's very important. Democracy requires that parties know how to lose. Democracy absolutely requires that parties know how to lose. That means that when we lose an election, when we lose a vote in Congress, we accept defeat, we go home, we may have a beer, we regroup, and we get ready to play again the next day. It's like having the crap beaten out of you in the Cotton Bowl by Clemson. It hurts, but you lick your wounds, and you get up and play another day, right? Right? Yeah, okay. But for parties to lose graciously, and that's the norm at play here, two conditions have to hold. To expect that parties will lose graciously, two conditions must hold. First of all, parties have to believe that they have a chance to win again in the future. And second, parties have to believe that losing will not bring ruinous consequences. It's not the end of the world. When politicians fear that they're not going to be able to win future elections, or when they believe that defeat is going to bring catastrophe, the stakes rise dramatically. Politicians' time horizons narrow. They throw the future to the wind, and they cling to power by any means necessary. In other words, desperation leads politicians to play dirty. My co-author, Dan Ziblatt, found this dynamic in early 20th century Germany. German conservatives were terrified by the prospect of democracy. They were terrified by the prospect of universal suffrage. For them, giving the working class, giving the poor the right to vote meant not only the right's electoral demise, but it meant the demise of the entire aristocratic order in which they lived. So conservatives responded to that threat by playing dirty, using fraud and repression to try to hold on to power for decades. Closer to home, think about Southern Democrats after the Civil War. Reconstruction and the 15th Amendment brought widespread black enfranchisement across the U.S. South. African Americans constituted an absolute majority or a near majority electorate in most Southern states. So their enfranchisement and their voting scared the bejesus out of Southern Democrats and their bases and their supporters. Not only did black suffrage threaten the Democratic Party's electoral dominance in the South, but it threatened to overturn the entire racial order in the late 19th century. Facing what they perceived to be an existential threat, the Democrats played dirty. Between 1885 and 1908, all 11 post-Confederate states passed laws that used poll taxes, literacy tests, property and residency requirements to effectively eliminate African Americans' voting rights. Black turnout in the South fell from 61% in 1880 to 2% in 1912. Unwilling to lose, Democrats stripped the right to vote from nearly half the population in the South, ushering in nearly a century of authoritarian rule. We fear that something similar is happening to the Republican Party today. The Republicans' medium-term electoral prospects are not great. The Republicans are, again, an overwhelmingly white Christian party, but white Christians are a declining share of the overall electorate. In 1994, the year of the Gingrich Revolution, white Christians were 74% of the electorate. By 2014, they were down to 58% of the electorate. By 2024, they will be less than 50% of the electorate. But it's much worse than that for Republicans because younger voters are now overwhelmingly Democratic. In last year's midterm elections, people my age and older, 50 years and up, split evenly between Republicans and Democrats. Republicans, 50 to 49%. But among people aged 18 to 29, Democrats won 67% to 32%. Among 30-somethings, Democrats won 59% to 37%. But the problem isn't just that the Republicans face a pretty bleak electoral future. It's that the Republican base has come to view defeat as catastrophic. And that's a product of the cultural and demographic changes that I mentioned earlier. Most Republican voters, or many Republican voters, I should say, fear they're on the brink not just of losing elections, but of losing their country, losing the country they grow up in. Slogans like "Take our country back," slogans like "Make America Great Again" reflect that sense of peril. So like the old Southern Democrats, Republicans have begun to play dirty. Since 2010, more than a dozen states, all of them controlled by Republicans, have adopted strict voter ID laws aimed at dampening turnout among poor and low-income voters. In Georgia, Republicans tried to suppress the vote in last year's gubernatorial elections. Republicans in Texas are trying to purge the voter rolls of tens of thousands of Latinos. In North Carolina, after the Democrats won the governorship in 2016, the Republican legislature passed a series of laws to pack state institutions and to weaken the incoming governor, including stealing two seats on the state Court of Appeals. Wisconsin Republicans followed a similar playbook in Wisconsin after Scott Walker's defeat last year. And in West Virginia last year, the Republican legislature impeached the entire Supreme Court. Even Perone, for God's sake, only impeached 3 out of 5 members of the Supreme Court. These guys impeached everybody. So Republicans across the country are starting to play dirty. The only way out of this mess is for Republicans to become a more diverse party. Once the Republicans learn how to compete successfully, seriously, for urban, secular, non-white votes, they will become more confident about winning elections, and they'll become less fearful of a multiracial America. When that happens, I think politics are very likely to depolarize, and our politicians can begin to reconstruct democratic norms. So the question is, what should Democrats do in the meantime? Well, an idea that's gained quite a bit of traction in recent months is that Democrats have to learn how to play dirty. They need to learn how to fight like Republicans. The argument goes something like this. If Republicans are going to continue to play constitutional hardball, Democrats must play tit for tat. If they don't, they will be victims of an endless series of sucker punches. Using forbearance, sticking with forbearance while the other guy's playing hardball, it's like entering a boxing ring with a hand tied behind your back. So Democrats have to use all the tools in their toolbox: government shutdowns, impeachment. There's even a growing movement to pack the Supreme Court next time Democrats control both the presidency and Congress. Several presidential candidates, including the mayor of the great city of South Bend, have declared themselves open to this idea. We think it would be a terrible, terrible mistake. A tit-for-tat strategy of constitutional hardball by Democrats would inevitably lead to escalation, which would only accelerate the politicization of our institutions and the erosion of our democratic norms. Once the process of escalating constitutional hardball begins, it becomes very, very difficult to reverse. If you look at other cases around the world, from Spain in the 1930s to Brazil in the 1960s to Chile in the 1970s to Turkey and Venezuela more recently, that sort of escalation rarely ends well. It's hard to find cases of politicians being able to sort of step off once the escalation has picked up. It is in fact, anyone who studies Latin America knows, much, much easier to weaken institutions than it is to build strong ones. We believe that it's in the Democratic Party's long-term interest to act to preserve our democratic norms. Remember, the Republicans are operating with pretty narrow time horizons. They are, in a sense, throwing the future to the wind and using any means necessary to hold on to power today because they are worried about their prospects in the future. But Democrats' future prospects are better. Their electorate is younger, their electorate is growing. The single greatest threat to Democrats' prospects in the medium term is an escalating conflict that puts our institutions at risk, one that either destroys our democracy or leaves it utterly dysfunctional. If Democrats start to fight like Republicans, they will be hurling themselves down that very path. Now, forbearance does not mean that Democrats should be passive or that they should be acquiescent. Forbearance does not mean abandoning vigorous opposition. It does not mean policy moderation. Bernie Sanders engages in forbearance. And finally, forbearance does not mean giving up on institutional reform. In fact, maybe the best response to Republican hardball is what constitutional scholar David Posen calls anti-hardball reforms. These are institutional reforms that blunt Republican power grabs in ways that lower the partisan stakes rather than escalating conflict. Let me give you a few examples. One example of anti-hardball reform is to respond to Republican gerrymandering, not with Democratic gerrymandering, like the Democrats tried in New Jersey, but rather an independent redistricting commission like was adopted recently in Michigan. Another example might be to respond to unfair voter ID laws with automatic registration and a serious system of universal voter identification. Third measure, a little bit more controversial, might be to respond to stolen Supreme Court seats, not with court packing, but with fixed terms and regular rotation in and out of the Supreme Court. Another thing, and I will close with this, that Democrats can do is work to reduce inequality. Levels of income inequality, again, are higher today than at any time since before the Great Depression. Between 1975 and 2015, the bottom 40% of American society saw its incomes stagnate. No gains over 2 generations. At the same time, the top 5% saw its income nearly double. There is no question that rising inequality has created a profound sense of unfairness in our society, and that has clearly helped to fuel racial resentment. There's also no question that rising inequality and declining social mobility have contributed to polarization and to right-wing populism in this country. The Democratic Party stopped talking about redistribution in the 1990s. It probably should take up those issues again. In fact, it is taking up those issues again. We are in the middle, I think, of an immense political earthquake. Again, we've begun a transition. We're in the middle of a transition that, to my knowledge, no democracy's ever successfully undergone. One in which a previously dominant ethnic group loses that majority and dominant status. I'm actually pretty confident we will make it to the other side, that we will be the first country to make that transition. But getting there, inevitably, getting to the other side is going to require that we pass through a period of intense and polarizing reaction. That's where we are right now. During that period of intense and polarizing reaction, Americans cannot afford to be reckless with our institutions. We have far too much to lose. Let me stop there. Thank you. Where's Maria?
We have some time for Q&A. We have a microphone that will be coming around the room. Maria, so raise your hand. Maria will bring you the mic. Please wait for the mic to come.
But Maria gets first question. Where is she?
I'm here.
Yeah, okay.
Well, my name is Maria Luisa Paul, and I'm from Venezuela. And while you were speaking, I basically thought you were talking about my country, not the United States. But even though we've all seen the repercussions that the Trump presidency has caused in the United States, he did empower more people to vote in the midterm elections. And now when we see the coming presidential elections, there are more candidates than ever for the Democratic Party. So don't you believe that this could be maybe a positive sign or a benefit that this has brought to the United States as well?
I think you're right. So I think you're right that there has been a very healthy pushback against abuse and attempted abuse in this country. We've seen mobilization among new groups, particularly my colleague Theda Scotchpole has been doing work on the ground in four communities in the heartland ever since 2016. And what she finds overwhelmingly is a massive increase in political participation by middle-class, middle-aged women. They are taking over local, not entirely Democratic, but mostly Democratic Party branches. They are running campaigns. They're being candidates. They're stepping up and engaged in politics like never before. So yes, that's a positive sign for that. That's a sign that we continue to have strong Democratic antibodies. 20+ candidates running for the nomination of the Democratic Party brings back to the front of my mind some of the pathologies that are associated with the primary process. It is far from clear to me that the Democrats will get the best candidate or the candidate they need out of this process. This is a completely unpredictable process. That again, it's very open, it's very democratic. There are many positive aspects to it, but it may not produce the candidate the Democrats need.
Hi, so where democracies die, I wonder who's in your dead pool around the world. which countries are most likely to have their democracies die. I wonder if you could maybe also comment on South Africa, where I used to live, and see what you think is going on with that democracy.
Where is democracy dead? Sadly, democracy is dead in Venezuela. I should take one step back. The number of fully established, fully democratic regimes that have died in the world is actually very small. There are not a lot. There's a lot of talk about democratic recession, authoritarian resurgence in the world. The number of fully democratic regimes that have collapsed is relatively small. Venezuela, unfortunately, is one of them. Turkey is another. Turkey was not nearly as established a democracy as Venezuela, but it's another case. Democracy died in Thailand several years ago. It is not all the way dead in Hungary, but Hungary was a real democracy that has slid into hybrid status. So there are some. There are not that many. The other question was South Africa. South Africa is one of these distinctive set of countries that has a dominant party for very good reasons, right? A party that heroically leads a liberation struggle on behalf of an overwhelming majority of the society is like the Indian Congress Party a couple of generations earlier is going to be electorally dominant for 30 or 40 years. That was entirely predictable and to be expected, and that is a danger. An imbalance of power like that between a governing party and the opposition is always a danger to democracy, without question. All of that said, I think South Africa has done quite well over the last 25 years. It continues elections continue to be free, civil liberties continue to be widely protected. There's still an independent rule of law. The corruption and abuse of power that was evident under the Zuma government, I think, has been at least partially corrected under the Ramaphosa government. So I actually think that South Africa has performed relatively well. Certainly has not died. I don't even think it's dying.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a really powerful presentation. I wanted to ask you two related questions. The first, you touched on how widening inequality creates resentment. At the other end of the economic scale, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on the role of big money, including dark money, the money that comes from corporations of people too, and the effect that that's had on driving hard right racist politics. The second one, when you talked about the need for elected governments to treat the institutions, for example, the Supreme Court and others, with respect, isn't there a danger if the courts end up reflecting such a regressive attitude that they themselves become an obstacle? And I'm thinking back to when FDR's reforms for the New Deal were consistently being blocked by the Supreme Court, and he played hardball with them. And I remember him as a hero, not villain, in my reading of history for doing that. And so your reflections on both those 2 points would be great.
Sure, great questions. So first of all, there are many ways to die. There are many ways for people to die. There are many ways for democracies to die. And big money, particularly in combination with with vast income inequalities, is clearly having a corrosive effect on the quality of American democracy. I think that is pretty clear. What's not clear, and we don't focus a lot on that in the book, because I don't see a really compelling link between that, which is a serious problem in and of itself. I don't see a link between that and the polarization that we focus on in the book. I don't see a clear link. I don't see big money, to quote you, driving hard right racist politics. I think these are two different streams. Now, I was on C-SPAN yesterday, and I did nothing but answer questions for an hour. Every single question except for one was some kind of a crazy conspiracy theory. It was unbelievable. The one question that was not a conspiracy theory involved this, and the hypothesis that the woman who called put out, which actually I think made some sense, is that the perception over time among voters that that their elected officials are not responsive to them, but rather responsive to donors, is very likely to lead to frustration, to anger at politicians, and make them much more likely to vote for politicians who promise to take a wrecking ball to the elite. I think that, again, I don't think it's driving racial or cultural polarization in this country. I don't think the Koch brothers created racial polarization, but I do think that it may contribute to populism. I think that may be true. Look, it's true. The Supreme Court is going to be a conservative-run institution for years to come. If progressives, I don't know if progressives will capture the presidency in Congress in the next 10 or 20 years. If they do, they're going to face an obstacle in the Supreme Court. I do not think that is justification for playing hardball. Strong institutions, non-politicized institutions, independent institutions, as someone who's spent 30 years studying Latin America, are really freaking hard to come by. They're really hard to build. Don't fuck with that.
Thank you very much. Listening to this talk was a pleasure. I have a question which relates to people. So far you have mentioned mostly institutions and political elites. And at the same time, you did mention that there is this huge contingent of people who nowadays see even marrying a person from a different party as some sort of a tragedy. Honestly, I'm one of those people. So I wonder, we can try to be political leaders can try forbearance, and Democrats can try to be as cognizant of this tradition, democratic norm you called it, as possible. But how do you kind of unbuild all of these tensions that are very visible in our day-to-day lives, with people making statements and behaving in, frankly, very humiliating ways towards others?
It's a tough call. So there's a lot of debate, and I'm not I pretend to be one, but I am not an expert in American politics. Far from it. I study Peru, but and Argentina. But there's a debate about how much of this is being driven by elites and how much of it is top down and a product of elite discourse, and how much of this is bottom up. And although you're right, we talk in the book mostly about what elites should not be doing. Our story ultimately is mostly a bottom-up story. We see underlying polarization pulling the parties apart. I do think, though, that, but it's clearly a self-reinforcing process. So politicians, Newt Gingrich didn't invent polarization. He didn't invent hardball. He was a pioneer, and that he was one of the early politicians to realize that hardball politics could be politically useful, that there was a constituency out there that might not have been out there 20 years earlier. So maybe it starts from below, he realizes it, but then elite behavior changes expectations among voters, and it affects the discourse and belief and behavior of voters. So it's a vicious circle. The clearest way out of it to me is for the Republicans to realize that to remain electorally viable, they have to change strategy. Now, this is not a far out idea, because after losing the 2012 election, the Republican Party itself did a report, a 90-something page report that they call the autopsy report of the 2012 election, that reads a lot like chapter 9 of our book. It basically says Republicans have to go out and win votes of young people and women and Latinos and other non-white voters. And they were right. But again, primaries take the party leadership, take the candidate selection out of the hands of party leaders. So my guess is that at some point, Republicans are going to take, if they continue along this sort of Californiization strategy, are going to do themselves some electoral damage. And when that happens, at some point, the Republican Party is going to change strategy. Somebody's going to come up and say, let's do this differently. When that happens, when the Republican Party elite begins to pursue a different strategy, I think there's a good chance it's not going to change neighbors' attitudes and behavior overnight, but I think it will have an important impact on rank and file.
Hi, my name is Carlos Moreno. I'm from Colombia, and I have Colombia. And I have two questions for you. The first one is related to my country. I remember at the end of your book, one of the sort of highlights that you were giving to Democrats was to look at how the opposition organized back into Colombia to push away Álvaro Uribe. And I really wanted to know whether you think 18 months after, you still think that's true, given what happened in Colombia with the new elections and like sort of the current political climate, if you will still write the same thing. And the second question I have is a little bit more general, in the sense that do you really think that Democrats can be successful at fighting economic inequality without adhering, or sorry, to some of these tactics that you sort of claim that are not democratic, like for quitting forbearance? And I don't know, my point is sort of just looking at the ACA and at the process through the ACA went through to pass, right? The Democrats were sort of called out because they were using some of the tactics that we were discussing today, right? So do you think is that at all possible in today's political climate?
It's tough. That's a great question. On Colombia, I would say yes. I would write the same thing. There would have been a great cost to political institutions in Colombia had Uribe managed to get a third term in the presidency. The 1991 Constitution was not designed to have the same guy in office for 12 years. It would have had a pretty dramatic effect on judicial appointments and other state appointments, and really would have potentially tilted the playing field in a serious direction. The fact that he could not run again in 2010 necessitated turnover, and I think that was incredibly healthy for Colombian democracy. The fact that the Uribistas won the election last year, I don't think, this certainly does not necessarily entail a return to I mean, these are people that I'm on, who are not terribly liberal, who I may not be fond of, but the potential for sort of a hegemonic power play is much, much weaker today than it was under Uribe a decade ago. So I don't think this is, again, there are many ways to die. Things could still go awry for lots of reasons, but I don't see the threat to Colombian democracy today that I saw a decade ago. Yeah, I mean, we have a system, an anti-majoritarian system, constitutional system in the United States. We have a million checks and balances built in that prevent dramatic policy change. And that is gonna, that works for the good when the guys you don't like or the people you don't like are in office. And it's a pain in the ass when your folks are in office. And the Democrats are gonna face that. And Democrats who feel there's an urgent need to combat inequality, or Democrats who pretty legitimately feel like there's an urgent need to address climate change, are legitimately very frustrated by the prospect of all sorts of minoritarian institutions blocking change. And that's so one debate maybe the first one will be over the filibuster, the Senate filibuster. Do you eliminate the filibuster? That's an anti-majoritarian institution, a strong anti-majoritarian institution. Would it be hardball to eliminate the filibuster? Again, I'm not an expert in American politics, but I don't think so, because I think the filibuster is now used systematically. The filibuster, if you go back to really any point between 1917 and the 1960s, the filibuster was a break the glass weapon of last resort. It's something very rarely used, only in case of emergency. Now it's used for all legislation. So the norm of restraint that allowed the filibuster to be an effective institution is long gone. It's been gone for a couple of decades now. It's now, it's a very, very different institution than it was. So I actually think that eliminating the filibuster is a good idea. A lot of my friends want to pack the court. I've got a friend from grad school leading a campaign called Pack the Courts. And he got your mayor to say that it's an idea worth thinking about. Again, the question, the guy who said that the Supreme Court's going to be an obstacle to reform, it's absolutely right. The question is the remedy worse than the disease? And I think court packing, politicization of the judiciary does a tremendous amount of long-run damage. It's a lot easier to politicize a court than it is to create an independent one. So I think the Democrats need to be really cautious, and that will mean that they'll get a smaller bite than they would like, even if they win a majority in Congress.
Thank you very much. It was a great presentation and I enjoyed the book. I'm just wondering, in addition to being overwhelmingly white and Christian, the Republican Party is also overwhelmingly male. And I think you can point to, in the 2016 election, the role of misogyny and gender in the rise of Make America Great Again, in addition to racism and the other issues you discussed. And I'm just wondering if you could address that. And is it an issue that also needs to change the Republican Party if we're going to get through this polarization period?
Yeah, that's a great question. We don't talk about gender much in the book, and if you've read it, you know that, and we've been taken to task for that, I think, legitimately. Yeah, I mean, the dynamic is the same. The folks at the top of the social, political, economic, cultural hierarchies 50 years ago were not only white and Christian, they were also male. And so it is primarily white Christian men who are status threatened. Well, I'm not going to say that. They're status threatened. White Christian men are all over the map politically, so we're not going to call them a problem. But so yes, I think that's right. I don't think that gender is the cleavage that other demographic that race is. I mean, if you tell me where somebody lives and what race or ethnicity they are, I can with great accuracy predict their partisanship. If you tell me what sex somebody is, it's harder. You're right. I'd be better off betting that she's a Democrat, but the divide is there are an awful lot of Republican women. That's not the fundamental cleavage dividing us, dividing the parties. I mean, there's a gender gap, but there's not a gender cleavage.
Hi, I'm Israel from Mexico. Thank you for the talk. I just want to, if you can give a reflection, because the title of the book and how the media and even in Mexico has taken it is as democracy as an already thing that is in the past and that we have to defend, or we have to defend basically that system. And if you have any reflection about the crisis of parties and the critique of elites that eventually led to this great force of outsiders, not only in the US, but you can see all over the continent. So yeah, so basically how much of democracy should we leave to the people and how much to the elites, the political elites and institutions? That's the big debate before us. This is something you're gonna have to restrain me because I could talk about it all day. Democracy as we know it, democracy as a 20th century institution is a very elitist regime. It is competition among political elites. In most of the 20th century, in most established democracies, elites that are strongly backed by what I'm going to call the political establishment, a small number of media outlets, a small number of political parties who control nominations, and a small number of actors, big labor, big business, that finance them. I'm talking about 40, 50 years ago. It was a pretty controlled competition among elites.
Citizens had the right to vote and choose among elites. That's a big deal. I don't mean to understate that. That matters a lot. Citizens had the freedom to organize, to protest, to criticize, to inform themselves, also incredibly important. But democracy as we know it is an elitist affair. That's changing. Democracies in the world are democratizing. There's a crisis of democracy for a number of reasons that we can talk about for a long time. But something else is happening. Political establishments, the institutions, the organizations that used to monopolize the resources that you needed to get elected. In 1955, if you wanted to be president of the United States, you absolutely had to be on good terms with NBC, ABC, and CBS. You had to get funding either from big labor or a handful of corporate elites or a small number of other interest groups. And you had to be given the nomination by party leaders of one of two parties. You could not run against the establishment in the United States of America in 1955. You had to be, in effect, I won't say the pocket, in the good graces of the political establishment. And that was true in varying degrees in different ways, really in all democracies across the globe. And that's changing dramatically. It's changing everywhere. It's changing in Brazil. It's changing in Italy. It's changed in Peru. It's changing in Argentina. It's changing in Mexico. It's changing in the United States. And establishments are weakening. Established parties are weakening, in part because they don't have the legitimacy they used to have, in part because they've allowed themselves to be internally democratized so that party elites can't control the nomination process. Fundraising has been democratized, so a handful of interest groups don't control finance anymore because Bernie Sanders can raise as much money with $27 donations online as Hillary Clinton can. The days in which the little guy can't raise money are done. And a small number of establishment media outlets no longer control who gets access to people, because you can, as we know, reach people via WhatsApp, Facebook, Twitter, etc. So the establishment, for structural reasons, political establishments everywhere from Spain to France to the United States to Brazil are losing their monopoly over the resources needed to get elected. That is, at some level, profoundly democratic. It's also much more volatile, and it makes it much easier for demagogues to get elected. So I think it may well be destabilizing. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? I leave it up to you.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I come from Venezuela, so definitely I would like to ask a question. So it looks like we are traversing an existential moment right now, with the opposition taking an important step forward. So I would like to ask you, some weeks ago, President Trump looked to take a very protagonist position. So, but of course, for the Venezuelan opposition, it is important. It is important the alliance with the U.S. So, what do you think it is a more positive relationship with the U.S. And second, what are the possible scenarios you envisage in Venezuela?
Oh God. Oh my God. All right. So look, I said this publicly and made a lot of enemies among my progressive friends. Trump's recognition of Guaido and tightening of sanctions was the first time that I strongly agreed with the Trump administration in 2+ years. I thought that was the right thing to do. I think this regime needs strong international pressure. I think there's a case to be made that Guaido is a more legitimate leader as coming out of an elected National Assembly than Maduro. And although it was risky, put it this way: I think the wrong people did the right thing for the wrong reasons. But I think it was the right thing to do. Now, It's not that Trump is a great promoter of democracy. In fact, his record in democracy promotion is awful. It's the worst since the early 1970s in the United States. We've become, really for the first time in 2 generations, a country that doesn't give a whit about promoting democracy abroad, which is terrible, terrible consequences for democracy. But the Trump administration doesn't really have a foreign policy team, doesn't really have a policy team, which allows the administration to, policy by policy, to be hijacked by small groups, by small factions. In this case, for better or worse, it's been hijacked by a combination of sort of Florida-based Cold Warriors and the last 2 human beings on Earth who think that invading Iraq was a good idea. These are not friends of mine, but they want to aggressively promote democracy in Venezuela. And the steps they've taken to date, I actually think are positive ones. If they take the step further and support a military invasion of Venezuela, I think it would be a disaster. I think it would be a disaster. And I have no idea whether they'll do that. But again, my feeling is that it's the crisis associated with it needs to be intense, not military, but intense external pressure on Venezuela. That there's no guarantee of anything, but I think it's what the international community should do. What will happen, and political scientists are horrendously bad at predicting anything. Most of us predicted, given these circumstances, the regime should have fallen by now. The military should have thrown Maduro under the bus by now. And if it happens tomorrow, we'll all say, well, we understand why. This is a surprisingly robust, stubborn regime. And I still think it's very likely to fall apart at some point in the near to medium term, but it's impossible to know when.
During the last presidential election, one of the interesting or paradoxical things was that the Democratic Party assumed, because of the very harsh anti-immigrant rhetoric, that the immigrant community, particularly the Latino community, would vote overwhelmingly Democratic. And actually the post-election polling showed that actually, Hillary Clinton actually didn't win as much of that vote as possible. And or as expected. And part of it had to do with this departure of the evangelical immigrant community to the Republican Party. And I'm sort of curious, what you think about that phenomenon and going forward. And the other thing is we didn't talk much about sort of work at the state level in the United States. The Republican parties had almost a 30-year project of kind of winning state legislatures, and thereby controlling the sort of state electoral processes and all the other politics at the state level. The Democratic Party effectively slept through that entire project when it was very visible. And then worse yet, Obama basically did not finance the party architecture for 8 years, and basically it was left high and dry for that whole period. Well, could you say a few things about what you think needs to happen at the state level, or what you see happening that might be encouraging?
I'm not sure I can find anything encouraging. So both excellent points. So it's true, the Latino vote did not go as heavily for Hillary Clinton as, say, African Americans and Jews. Didn't go 90% Democrat. It still went and continues to be roughly 2-to-1 in favor of Democrats. And that's pretty overwhelming. That's a pretty sizable majority. But I mean, the Latino community is very diverse. They come from a large number of different national backgrounds. The politics at a state-by-state level are very different. Republicans have been very successful among Latino voters, particularly in Texas, but in other parts of the South. Florida has its own dynamics because, primarily because of the history of Cuban Americans. And there's some evidence of a gender gap, even a larger gender gap, with Latino men tilting towards Trump more than Latino women. But I wouldn't make too much. It's not like it's split 50-50. Latinos are overwhelmingly Democratic. And I think it's a reasonable prediction that with the position the Republican Party is taking today, it's going to reinforce the Latinos' entry into the Democratic Party in the future. I think it may not be as extreme as California, but I think what we're seeing, we're seeing to some degree a reproduction of what happened in California in the 1990s. In the early 1990s, Pete Wilson thought it was a really good idea to take an anti-immigrant position, and it actually was in the short term. It helped him, helped the Republicans win a couple of elections, and it disabled the party for more than a generation. The Republican Party is now the third largest party in, or the third largest party affiliation in California, which in a two-party system is really hard to do. So I think it's true. The Latino community is very diverse, and people are diverse. So you never expect 99% of any demographic group to vote for a particular party. People have different views, but 70% Democrat is a pretty big number, and I think that's likely to persist if the Republican Party continues down the path it's on. At state level, I think you're right. The Republicans have been very effective. They have followed a strategy of winning at the state level. Democrats, for reasons that I don't understand, well, that I only partially understand, did drop the ball for a long time. I think you're absolutely right. I think it had real consequences. There are some structural factors at play, though. There are because American politics has become much more nationalized. The patterns of politics at the state level are now much more similar than, I mean, they're different in terms of how blue or how red they are, but basically anywhere you go in the United States today, unlike 50 or 60 years ago, anywhere you go, the more small town and rural you get, and the more ethnically homogeneous you get, the more Republican you get, the more urban, the more Democrat. And so it's just a function of how many big cities you have in your state. That's what determines the color of your state. And there are many states in this country that are overwhelmingly red, that are overwhelmingly rural, where the Democrats, you may disagree, and maybe, I'm not in a position to say, you may disagree with the decision of the Democrats not to invest anything in Oklahoma. But the counter argument is the Democrats could invest everything in Oklahoma and they'd still lose. And so there are, I don't know how many states, a couple dozen states, close to a couple dozen states in this country that, given the partisan affiliations, it's really hard for the Democrats to win. The Democrats nationally have as many votes as Republicans, but they're concentrated in a handful of states. They're concentrated in New York and California and a handful of other states. There are a lot of states in this country where the Democrats are going to have they could invest in party building as much as they want. They're still not going to win Oklahoma. That's an overstatement, but there are structural reasons why the Democrats have not played seriously in many states.
We were supposed to end about now, and we go over time. So let's just thank Steve for his talk, and I'm sure conversations will continue in the reception and the board outside this room. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.